coming.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to 3 Shots of Espresso, our weekly podcast. This week, myself and Sidi Mohammed Ismail will be discussing the gradual erosion of modesty and bashfulness within our society. We've dubbed this podcast Modesty Dumped, and we will be exploring the gradual loss of modesty within society and the implications of that, as well as its sources. And perhaps maybe we could even delve into how we can reclaim modesty itself. Assalamu alaikum, Mohammed Ismail. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm well, and you, my brother? Looking good, mashallah.
Shukran jazeelan. All good, can't complain.
I guess not unsettled, but just concerned in case there's some feedback. As we all know, I think there's Diwali being celebrated in both our communities. So if there's any blast in the background, it's not because we're in a war zone, but rather because we are, we share a common space with other faiths. And yeah, that's why you'd hear some blast going off in the background.
Definitely with you on that. But also, important events took place on Monday, local government elections. It's interesting how people have responded to that. The IEC is reporting a low voter turnout. Also, the results that are coming in so far does show basically the general trust of what people feel they can trust different parties with. So considering our discussion that we had last week with Sandile Ibrahim Maloy, a very, very fascinating discussion. I think the future, politically speaking, we're living in very interesting and exciting times, and we all have a very important role to play in building a society that will function through active citizenship. But more about that later. Let's move on to tonight's topic, inshallah.
Perfect. Let's go for it, inshallah. If you would like to set it up based on what we had discussed, perhaps maybe for our listeners and viewers, you can set it up and then we can kick off from there.
Okay. Based on our discussion, I believe there was one of the senior scholars of Muslim community of South Africa delivered a discourse very, very recently about the decay of modesty and bashfulness, haya as we term it in Arabic, within our societies. And that obviously has led to tonight's discussion, not wanting to always play the socio-political and economic card regarding our podcast. But we are talking about Islam and life and everything in between. And we're not just living as materialists. We also believe that there is a metaphysical reality that we are part of. And modesty within the Islamic tradition, but actually within global traditions, is quite a fascinating discussion. There's an entire anthropology behind it about how different communities respond to modesty. But there's also movements that are rebelling against, traditional concepts of modesty, whatever those concepts may be. However, different, religions and cultures have conceived modesty and how they practice modesty in dress, in behavior, in speech. And there is a movement against that, and there are also movements to reclaim modesty itself. So, yeah, that has basically framed tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Anwar. And I think, the general trend would be to talk about modesty from an outer perspective. So we talk about, the garments that we wear. I think there's also modesty that's got to do with the innate qualities that we engender that sort of, create some sort of bashfulness within us that prevents us from maybe perhaps delving into certain discussions in a particular manner. In other words, also in other aspects, also how we think internally. And I remember Sheikh Yahya An-Ninawi said something very interesting, and this I heard from him many years ago. He said, do not make your mind a garbage can, and in terms of what you think. And I think that lends itself to the thoughts that we have, are we also modest within ourselves and our inner voice? Just to build also onto the discussion, yes, I was in attendance last night, and that's why I also brought it up with you at a program. And the scholar just said that, you know, in terms of the challenges of our time, others have diagnosed many, you know, problems, but one or two of them was mentioned, and he mentioned that he believes that this is the predominant two aspects that we're currently facing. That's an onslaught in terms of us as humans, you know, and it has to do with human civilization. One is bashfulness, modesty. And he in particular mentioned dress code, and we'd like to expand that tonight and talk about it in different levels, as we've already said. And then secondly is the onslaught on faith and belief. And from a Muslim and Islamic perspective, the faith and onslaught on our beliefs. He did mention that other religions are perhaps not as targeted, and he went on to say certain things about other religions. We won't mention that, or I won't mention that, but just to safe to say that he did talk about Islam in a primary sense being the focal point from a religious onslaught perspective in the world. Many people are targeting Islam and Muslims for their beliefs and trying, of course, to erode that. So those are the 2 points you mentioned, but I mean, we're going to discuss modesty and haya, as we had termed it in Arabic. And I'm always drawn to the prophetic narration in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, and I learned this in school, in the, I think, standard 8, standard 7. So this goes back to the late 90s. And, you know, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that when you, you know, when you've lost all modesty, all bashfulness, then you may do as you please, you know, then do as you please. And I would like to sort of link up do as you please to the sort of the liberal democracies which we find ourselves in today, which champion freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of consciousness, all of these freedoms, and they are championed, but to a large extent also these freedoms are championed to the extent that they leave us without any, you know, guardrails. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, in my understanding here, is telling us that there are guardrails that you need to stick within. So maybe we can, you know, we can get into it from there. I don't know what you think about that, those few points.
No, I love what you're saying. You know, that if you have no modesty, then you will do as you will. I will not even go you know further to say that people will be people will be like animals, because I mean, as believers in Islam, we basically we see animals as, you know, creatures of God that have their own communities, you know, and they, yes, have not been given free will like human beings, right? But they do have basically a certain model of behavior that they follow, you know, very naturally. They are already programmed to behave in certain ways, and they fulfill their function within the broader scheme of the world and creation itself. So when we start to do as we will without, you know, modesty as one of those guardrails, you know, in mind, in thought, in action, not just restricted to dress, and not also just let's say women policing, you know, we'll get into that later, then we will become lower than animals. I think the idea of being a human being is very much tied to the idea of being an abd, you know, a slave of God. Also the idea of, let's say, a khalifa on the earth, a vicegerent on the earth, meant to live out a certain mission, you know, a life of absolute devotion and subservience to God itself, to God himself. So in that sense, you know, when you lose the guardrails, basically you lose basically your entire control system. And we know, and we are seeing society disintegrate in many different ways, not just socio-economically and politically, though that is, you know, obviously a firm favorite of our discussions between ourselves, but there are even that has roots that really questions, like, let's say, the purpose of man. And you know, for example, we know that how can I say, for years people were conditioned into a certain kind of behavior, when you look at, almost every culture around the world, right? They had certain kinds of, a certain type of morality and certain values about how they conducted themselves. But in, like, let's say the modern period and the postmodern period that we live in, we are now in the postmodern period, the age of postmodernism, we are questioning the foundation of those moral traditions. Islam is no different. Islam is being questioned. On what basis does it make certain moral claims? On what basis does it impose a morality? And what that morality is, basically one of its concepts is modesty. And part and parcel of the sexual revolution that we have had, maybe from the 20th century up until now, questions that, because yes, it is again also tied to, let's say, the liberal movement that is sweeping across the world, and where everything, morality itself has now become really, really subjective. It's subjective, and because it's so subjective, at the end of the day, there's no right and there's no wrong. They are just perspectives. They are just opinions. Each person's opinion, or each opinion itself, even if they are not the opinions of man, but they are the opinions of God, right? They're equally valid. And because they're equally valid, unless there's legal injunctions, legal rulings from, perhaps like, let's say, a government that prohibit certain actions, or encourage the performance of certain actions, everything else is just relative. And that's the world in which we live in.
Indeed. And I mean, just to call it out, and I'll just talk about a few that come to mind that sort of is eroding this modesty that we have. Number one, though we can go into it from an educational perspective, the fact that now sexuality and multiplicity of sexual orientations are being taught to kids at a very young age and almost at a premature age is one aspect for me that talks to the eroding of modesty and taking away that bashfulness at a young age. Many would say that even a young child, an innocent child, once that child gets exposed to even what we would term in the old days soft porn, and now that too is even, there's no longer, I think, I would imagine, not imagine, I don't want to imagine, but I would, there's no such thing as soft porn anymore. It's flat out hardcore. And once that child at whatever age in those initial years gets exposed to that, it has then eroded almost everything. From there onwards, it only gets worse. So that's another one. And I would also like to, what comes to mind is the aspect of when we were growing up, people talked about Sandy Bay, and they said nudity, nude beaches. At those days, we used to laugh at it, but it was one of those things that just, I mean, if you think about it now from a modest perspective, anyone can come and just, walk around without any clothes on. So that too lends itself to dressing. And then I think the way ideas are expressed, provocative, before there used to be warning signs that this conversation is about to be, discuss issues of an adult nature. And then when that would happen, it would be late at night. Nowadays, it happens at any time of the day. And even though those disclaimers are put on, it's still very much in prime time, or time when children or people that do not want to be exposed to that level of conversation, are then left with very little choice. So I mean, it's impacting the way we think about ourselves, the way humans feel, and how they then act it out. Modesty is something that is now frowned upon when someone says, and we also have to acknowledge that from a subjective perspective, everyone probably has different or varying limits of what they consider comfortable for themselves. Of course, there'll be laws in place, and we live by a moral and religious code. That law is there. But someone may say and we talk about this, as you know, from a jurisprudence perspective, we say, what is the thing to do that gives you more God consciousness? So someone may say though it's fine to be in a specific certain place with strangers, whether it be males or females. But from a God consciousness perspective, I personally don't like to be there. Now, even that is being taken away from us. Oh, why are you doing that? Why do you want to add extra stuff? Why? And then, questions get asked of. So you talk about liberty and freedom, but you want to take away my liberty and freedom,
Yeah.
So I mean, I just wanted to give you a sense of where my thoughts go to immediately when we talk about modesty, and the things that we've been exposed to that I believe has slowly eroded, what was once a very, innocent person, an innocent individual, an innocent mind.
No, I'm 100% with you. And, you used the example of pornography and exposure to pornography or even material of an adult nature, right? But the thing is that as the years are rolling on, what we're seeing is that basically things are becoming much, much more explicit. But this is not just with regards to, obviously, visual content and even audio content. It's basically challenging family values on a wide scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, type of discussions that the children needed to be prepared for, right? And which we must critique our community on. Sometimes, in these very sincere attempts at being modest, of having haya, certain discussions were not had with children at an appropriate age. So people were ignorant. This is a fact, right?
Yeah.
Like sex education is an example, right? It was delayed for too long. But on the other hand, now it's too premature and there's overexposure to a point that, for example, and I can say it because I mean we try to attempt to deal with real issues here. We are seeing within our society, because of one of the consumption of pornography, right, in its various forms, people are trying to reenact that within their own lives, and oftentimes to devastating consequences, to a point where we see the breakdown of the family unit itself. And here I am talking about divorce, right?
Yeah.
And the notion of, let's say, child molestation is real. It usually does get swept under the carpet, as most things within our society. So hence, we can never actually address real social problems unless they reach critical mass and they literally explode. Then you will have an individual case, ending up perhaps in maybe a counseling clinic somewhere, or it's dragged into the courts, or for example maybe an alim or a social worker will have to deal with that, or a trusted family member. But that's literally when the case has exploded. But we never dealt with this as a society in a very I would say constructive manner before. And that's really where we're sitting. So on the one hand was our extreme behavior, extreme cautiousness before, but then the extreme laxity that we see now. I would say there's no middle route, and that has led us to where we are now.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think this goes to what is our approach to education, what is our approach to, and we talk about from an Islamic perspective, we talk about tarbiyah, and this exercising or this rearing a child or an individual. Remember, tarbiyah is not only something that's for youngsters. Adults require tarbiyah. Mature people require tarbiyah, because life is a journey, and one never stops learning. And you constantly have to be introspective and say, is there gaps in my approach to life? Is there gaps in my character? Is there gaps in my worship, and so forth? And so we constantly wanting to either do tarbiyah to ourselves, by ourselves, or under the guidance of others. And when I say guidance of others, it could be in the form of a teacher, an Islamic teacher. It could be in the form of a coach, a mentor. So a mentor-mentee relationship, a coach-coachee relationship. And it could also be, sometimes in a work environment between an employee and an employee. So people are constantly looking for tarbiyah, and should be constantly looking for tarbiyah. And I think our approach to life should have those key moments when discussions are had and the right topics are broached. Right now, I would even say, go so far as to say, is some of those traditional points and milestones in life where these discussions were supposed to have happened, not delayed and not brought forward, at that point. Now, maybe perhaps we have to even relook at when those happen. Perhaps it does now need to be brought forward, because as we know, our minds are exposed to these things on a daily basis, and children are seeing it nonetheless. So I think we also don't want to go into the diagnosing the issue. We all know that where the challenges lie. It lies in our media, it lies in our entertainment, it then permeates into our education system, and then ultimately, where does it manifest itself? Where does immodesty manifest itself? It manifests itself in human action. So a person then goes out and determines, okay, I am going to dress this way, male or female. I am going to speak this way. I am going to think this way, and I'm going to educate others this way, and I'm going to create an environment where anything goes. So you can take your children to Phuket, and you'll find that a lot of people will say to you, don't go and just walk around with your kids in Phuket, because at night in Bangkok, it's I think, Phuket, Bangkok, these places are in Thailand, these places are just completely no holds barred, anything goes. It doesn't matter whether you have your kids with you or not, you're going to be exposed to unsavory things. And this is what we're saying, is that it leads to that. So our discussion here, at least what I wanted to bring to the table was, we know the problems, we can go on and speak about it, and we can also offer solutions. But I think we just need to start to talk about it more often, because what part of the agenda to take away morality and modesty is to suppress the right, or to suppress discussions about it. So you don't know what is good values. We no longer talk about it.
No, but on the point, I'm with you. I mean, we can always talk about, like you said, we can always talk about the reasons why, right? And what the problem that we're sitting in with. But really, what part and parcel of the problem, and I see this here also, is that even within our religious circles, and how I use this word religion, but rather within our religious circles, unfortunately, and there's this Arabic word we have, takalluf, which means basically pretentiousness, right? Sometimes there is too much pretentiousness around certain subjects, and it's done from a good place, from a place of sincerity, from a place of wanting to behave correctly, not to be bashful, to be modest in speech. It comes from a really, really good place, but because of an overindulgence, become overly pretentious, we don't actually speak about what needs to be spoken about. So this would mean, for example, the religious discourse of our society then becomes so filtered, watered down, that some topics are not dealt with. And you spoke about the right types of tarbiyah at the right times within our lives, right? There isn't an age of becoming, or a rite of passage that young men and women pass through within our societies. In one of our earlier podcasts, we spoke about youth groups, and when youth groups do it right, and the impact that they can have on a person's life, male or female. And I think this is one of those areas where they can really play a significant role over and above the family environment, which is key. Parents need to be having the right discussions with the kids at the right time, and also the schooling system, right? And we do need institutions that basically, I would say, put our kids to the test in some way, that they pass to a rite of passage, that almost like, in some cultures within the South African landscape, or within South Africa, there is, like, let's say, the initiation school, right? It's not just a basically a retreat, a weekend retreat, or however long it may be, maybe a week or 2 weeks, basically, of people living on a mountain or in the bush, and where they get they go for what is the word, basically where they undergo surgery.
Ukutola. Isn't it Ukutola? Something like, I think it's
Ukutola,
called
right.
in Xhosa.
Yes, right. And it's not just about that. It's more also about, they get taught about what it means to be a man. Now, in the context of men, that itself, coming out of an initiation school, is a rite of passage. Right? It's a cultural thing, right? Yes, in South Africa, culture and religion is oftentimes intertwined, right? There's no doubt about that. We can ask ourselves within the contemporary Muslim community in South Africa, what are our rites of passage? Yes, when a man or woman reaches the age of sexual maturity, they become baligh, right? That is a rite of passage itself. But there needed to be a certain amount of preparation, to when you come to this point, and now your body starts to change. Now you will be basically held accountable for your actions, right? Up until this point, your record with God was a clean slate. It was easy money, so to speak, because like whatever good you did, that was just to your to your credit in the eyes of Allah, and whatever wrong you did, you're not held accountable for it because you're not bad, right? But once you become physically mature, you should have been mentally mature as well for the responsibility of taklif, to hold your own mantle. And when that happens, then essentially now you need to be responsible for yourself and conduct yourself accordingly. And it's like having a driver's license. You don't get a driver's license and then learn how to drive. You're starting to learn how to drive beforehand. You get your driver's license, and then you can hit the road. And you're going to behave responsibly, right? And you can speed and enjoy yourself on the road every once in a while, but that's when you go down to Kyalami racetrack and you enjoy that, right? You don't necessarily do that on the N12 during peak hour traffic. Please don't. It's a problem, right? So there needs to be these rites of passage, right? And we as a society, we don't have that. So, one of the things that we have, a student matriculates at the age of 18 or 19 years old, right? Maybe even 20, but usually by 18, that's within South Africa. And then, I've matriculated, I can't be told anything, I'm an adult, or I've reached 21 and I'm old enough. But are you prepared? But beyond that, we also have to ask, beyond the educational system, how have we prepared ourselves?
Look, I think you talked about it from an Islamic religious perspective, and I think one of the books that I always refer to in this regard, and it's a book taught in Yemen as part of the curriculum. It's called Riyadatu Sibyan, Educating Children. And in there, the author goes on to essentially give parents a guide on how to rear a child. In that sense, there, in that particular book, he is in fact talking to the father who's rearing his male son, his male child. And in there, those are universal principles, even though it goes into specifics that has got to do with the male. But the point I wanted to make is that these are taught to a child at a young age because it then helps the parent and the child, sort of get through discussions at an appropriate time. It teaches the parent when to do what and how to go about doing it, and then also talks about empowering the child from that age onwards. So, for example, and this may I think these are things that are not spoken about. So I'll mention one or two for the benefit of ourselves in this discussion. For example, the author says, do not endear the child to lavish things. Do not give the child freedom that whatever they want, they get, right? Or even the color of clothes that you choose for the child. Do not choose eccentric colors. Choose block colors that lends itself to peacefulness. It lends itself to humility, as an example. It is famously said that one of the late scholars of the Indian subcontinent, Maulana Zakaria Kandehlawi, he and his father was very strict on him, right? But the man that he became was because of the rearing that he had under his father. And his father, perhaps maybe in my mind, would not have taught this approach to others, at least not at the level that he was doing with his son, but he was working on his son for a reason, you know. And some may also even see some of that type of education and parental approach. They may see it as very constricting, and they may have negative things to say about it. That probably is also in its place, and everyone is free to critique as they wish. But the point is that at the end of the day, what in hindsight, what did that parent develop? Did that parent develop someone of high stature, morality, ethics, and values? We can certainly see that in his life. And we have seen it in other parents who adopt this approach, which is a educational centric approach, a friendship approach with their children, and also, you know, bringing in the right discussions at the right time. We see that those children, when they then go out into the world, when they see things that are immodest, they're able to identify it. Now, at that point, that's as much as the parent actually can do to an extent. You know, how much can you can give the tools, but how those tools are applied, really, that then becomes the responsibility. And that's why I'm happy you talked about being mukallaf and baligh, is because at that point, we actually believe a child is now, and a human now becomes morally responsible. So now there's no longer excuses. So we believe that you have the capacity to then make a decision right or wrong. And just on this point, and I'll end with this here on this point, a lot of us will say, oh, so now child is 13 and he's become baligh, or at 15, you know, and there are various signs for when a child becomes baligh and morally responsible. We say, oh, so now the child has to take on all this burden of doing right and wrong, and then, you know, has to carry the weight of sin and the glory of good actions. And they say, but it's too young. But if you look at society today, the things that children are getting involved in at 6, 7, just on your YouTube and on, you know, on the internet, is much worse than we would have ever have imagined. And nobody's saying, oh, there are people that are saying this, but those liberal people are not critiquing that aspect of modern day life. The children are, you know, being exposed to 1,001 evil qualities, character traits that they then manifest. Just today I was seeing in the UK, I can't remember the name of the motion picture, but for children, already at a young age, children are being taught to cross-dress, for example. Now, from our religious and Islamic perspective, that's not a good trait. It lends itself to, you know, confusing the sexuality of the child and the gender of the child. And then in the mind of the child, they're not sure where they should land up, in the male or female section. So those are things we, you know, we will call out people on the case of religious obligations, but then we leave it to the free will of the whole world and its media to indoctrinate them at, say, 6 and 7.
I'm with you, but here's a question we must ask, right? So we always, when we're talking, we frame in modesty, you know, in dress, in actions, you know, in words. What always comes to mind is that basically being modest is being boring. You know, it's a kind of like, you know, that nice guy thing, right? You know, that nice guy thing. Yeah. Now, I always separate between being the nice guy and being the good guy. I say, you know, be the good guy, because the nice guy is the guy that, you know, is a people pleaser, is a yes man, is a guy that, you know, basically is going to get thrown under the bus, right? Because I mean, that is neither here nor there. He's not focused. He's not deliberate. He's not decisive, right? He's just like going with the flow, right? And that's a problem. The good guy, yeah, he may have a nice personality, maybe reserved, maybe, you know, very expressive, but at the end of the day, he has a moral compass. You should have a focus, right? So I always separate between the two things. You can be good and you're not necessarily boring. And, you know, so does modesty always have to be boring? Because let's face it, you know, with the hypersexualization of the world right now, right? Even in marketing and advertising, to sell anything, all right? Or at least this was the problem in the early, between the 1970s, 1980s, right up until the 2000s, right? And it's been critiqued quite a bit, but it's still prevalent, right? About everything had to have, almost to sell almost any product, there had to be some kind of sexual innuendo, right? And anything else was looked, as being like, boring, too conservative, too black and white, too square, right? So does modesty have to be boring?
Yeah, look, I mean, that is a good question, because this is what we are led to believe, is that, conservatism is something that, it lends itself to rigidity, and from there onwards, it leads to extremism, and from extremism, what the rest of the story goes, and especially when it's linked to religion. Then I think you get religious people that do feel that, they're living within a cage, and we are unable to express ourselves, and had we had the opportunity, we would have perhaps maybe done things differently. These are all mental boundaries that and challenges that do occur in society, and I do think, for example, going back to whether you were the in crowd or not, you could be seen as the one who, like the girl in a clique, and she doesn't dress in a very provocative way, she feels out. A guy that's in another clique, he doesn't watch pornography or doesn't pick up hookers on the weekend, so he feels left out. Another guy in a specific other environment, he doesn't speak with a lot of cussing, and he doesn't do the sexual innuendo all the time. In various circles, it plays itself out, and this happens in all spheres of social life. I think we would be appealing to, again, we appeal actually to the moral code and consciousness of the individual, is to say, can you answer the question, is it modest, for example, to urinate in public, right? And I know between morality and modesty, there's perhaps maybe a distinction, but modesty also is what prevents you from doing certain acts. For example, urinating in a public space where everyone's watching you, or getting so intoxicated that you lose your mind, and then you end up hitting on young girls or old women if you're a young guy. Is that modesty? Or for example, becoming such an immodest person that you're willing to sell your soul to the devil, as it proverbially said, to sell a product, Just today I saw, maybe you can tell me, so even marketing, today I saw a advert for a Muslim biokineticist, I think, biokineticist. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
It's a very interesting profession, I must say. I've been to a biokineticist in my lifetime, right? Because, I had issues with my elbows, right? What you call ligament laxity or crepitus in the joints. It's a fascinating thing that they do. Like really, I enjoyed myself when I used to go to a biokineticist.
And maybe you can suggest that you'd like to go on to her ad, because she had a picture of a male and a female, barely dressed,
right,
and put on an advert, So my question though is, do we need to go to that level and sort of bring out the archetyped person that would go for this type of service in order to sell the product, Is that lending itself to modesty? Is that lending itself to, perhaps maybe I have an issue, but I don't want to see an ad like that and I need your service, We would rather say we're not appealing to boring people. We're appealing to what is morally acceptable. And again, as Muslims, we have to say this, brothers and sisters, and I say this to myself firstly, we have a responsibility to Allah, the Most High and the Most Great. We have been taught by our guide, our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. We have a legal code that we are very proud of. And we have a moral system that guides our action, And as much as you and I mean, we don't have to be vulnerable on the show, but we also can admit that there are times when we ourselves, get caught up in perhaps some sort of innuendo or some sort of misogyny sometimes, I'm not saying we are misogynists, I'm saying, but it could lend itself to that, and we also need to call ourselves out for that, and we ask Allah, the Most High, to protect us and keep that veil over it, but recognizing it is part and, is half of the problem solved. It's not making it the norm. Do I want my child and my cousin and my nephews to pick up those traits and then become as lax about it? No, I don't, because I'm afraid that tomorrow they'll be disrespectful to the gender, the opposite gender, if the innuendo is, at the expense of say from males to females, and maybe from females to males. I don't want them to pick that up. And again, that's part of preserving this modesty.
No, but
so, is it boring? I do think it's boring. Yeah, I do think people see it as boring. That's why we need to be more provocative. So,
I think it's for example, when the notions of modesty become boring, is that when immodesty basically becomes fashionable, right?
Yep.
Also,
exactly.
right, another problem that our society suffers from is that the lack of creativity, right? Now, any good faqih will tell you, any good jurist, right, will tell you that creativity is a part of fiqh. Creativity is a part of fiqh, right? Because if you're going to be solving jurisprudential problems, you need to in some ways be like a bit of like an out of the box kind of a thinker, right? It's a fact. So when we think of modesty, what do we think of? Let's contextualize. In our society, it means that a person's wearing a thobe, a person's wearing an abaya, and a jalbab, and that's all that they wear, right? And always the colors are dark, like as black as my thobe is now, right? And that's all you wear, right? But let's take a step. We like Islamic history so much, and we like the culture discussion so much, right? When you look at the wide spectrum of, let's say fashion, right, and the use of color and unique designs, throughout the world, and when you narrow it down to the Muslim world itself, which is not just limited to the Middle East. Take, for example, Africa, right? Some of the thobe designs that you will find in East and West Africa. What we find from, like, let's say the Hijaz, it may put some of it to shame in terms of creativity, right? It's absolutely beautiful. But also we got to now, hand it over, really give the credit here to, I would say, what this resurgence of Islam that we see in many parts of the world, despite the pressures that Muslims are under, right, is that there is a modesty movement that's brewing, not just in the Middle East, not just in the Christian West, right, where there's pushback, right, particularly against liberalism, right, is that even locally, people are basically designing modest attire. When we're talking about dress, modest attire that fits very well within the Islamic lifestyle. So it's not just the thobe, it's not just an abaya, for men and for women. It would meet the requirements of modesty that the Sharia demands in terms of clothing, right? But it's also culturally sensitive and with an attempt to try to be trendy and fashionable, right? When we're talking about clothing. Also, in terms of speech and behavior, like in terms of behavior, some information I was engaging with, that in some parts of the West, you have, let's say, for example, certain student societies, oftentimes tend to be Christian student societies, right? That are trying to push back against, let's say, certain forms of, like, let's say, promiscuity or certain types of freedoms that can lead to promiscuity. So we're talking about certain student societies are calling for curfews on university campuses, in terms of residences, right? There's also what they call, like, let's say, within certain churches, the idea of promoting, like, let's say, modesty as a virtue, right? So there are basically classes on manhood and classes on womanhood, right? Where modesty is one of the virtues that are stressed, not just in dress, but also in action, right? Also in speech. So there is, some type of a pushback against basically the promiscuity of the age. And some writers, from basically the Christian world, they say, when you're doing this here, it's kind of like promoting a sexual revolution, not in a promiscuous sense, but in the sense of we are taking ownership of our bodies, or in our entire person. We're not just sexualized beings, we're much more than that. So if that is the case, how we're going to behave, how we're going to dress, how we're going to act, how we're going to speak is all going to reflect it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, um, and we want to hear more of these voices, because sometimes Islam and Muslims do feel like a lone, a lone voice in the dark, asking the world to be better people, and we're led to believe that we are the only ones that want to bring people back to some sort of conservative approach to life in this modern world where everything gets eroded. It just reminds me of one point I wanted to make, Anwar, was, for example, and at some point, a friend told me about a sitcom or series, I don't know whatever you want to call it, called Modern Family. And when he sketched what that whole, I think, whole sitcom was premised on, just by the explanation of what he told me about it and the title they used, it lends itself to so many violations from a moral and modest code. And just to think, people are considering this normal. Sometimes I tell people, myself personally, irrespective of what I may really be, I just can't stomach the fact that sometimes people could sit in a room as a family, and then a sexual scene comes on the TV and nobody blinks an eye. I mean, what type of lack of modesty, and I take myself now out as an example, but if it were just a normal, loving, healthy family, mother, father, and children sitting around a TV, for example, and watching the scene, and then nobody blinks an eye, no one closes an eye, no one feels abhorrent by what they are seeing. Is that what we really want? Is that what we're calling for? So I guess we're just calling to that, and I just wanted to add that. Maybe in closing, I would like, from my perspective, I don't know if you would allow me to, as we get, you can make a few points if you want to, but I want to talk about just a few points that come to mind about how we believe, at least I reflect on this from an Islamic perspective as a Muslim, as someone who's attempting to try and find, the guidance in our faith, the areas where I think modesty does play a role. So I don't know if
sure.
Okay.
Look, I mean, naturally, one of the sicknesses of our society is that, the overemphasis on the outward while forgetting the inward, right? That is a problem. I think modesty should start from within inside and reflect outside. We can chew gum and walk at the same time, right? So the two things should be done together. We also have to understand that it's a journey. So in this, the very city of Johannesburg, and I don't know if such groups still exist, but there was what they called a hijab support group for the sisters. Now I'm just using this as an example for sisters, right? Because the problem of modesty and immodesty is not just a thing about women. It applies to men, as we've spoken about in this entire discussion. But the two things need to go together, right? Also, part of modesty in speech is basically that every second word doesn't have to, doesn't have to be a bleep. When you speak, it doesn't have to be a vulgarity. Is that learning to speak without using vulgar language? Yes, it's a challenge. There's no doubt, right? But learning to retraining yourself, and this requires that. I mean, for example, I know brothers and sisters who, for some reason or the other, may have found themselves, treading a path other than what they wanted and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had designed for them. But as they came back to Islam, they had to relearn Islam and realign themselves, right? And at the start, what always happens is that they tend to to be a little bit more extreme than the Sharia even wants, right? Or they will adopt the strictest opinions that they can find in the Sharia. But this is just because the journey that they're going through, and then eventually then they even out. But they have to sometimes they have to almost kind of relearn all the interactions, from speech to dress, other forms of interactions. Watching, for example, to what extent do they engage basically the opposite gender, how they appear in public. But I mean, it's all part and parcel of a journey itself, so again, also not modesty policing, not gender shaming. I think as a society, we need to be careful of that.
No, indeed. And I mean, going back to the point about in the inequalities, for example, and may Allah grant us the opportunity to practice upon it, both males and females are commanded to lower their gaze.
Yeah.
You know, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he told the females that, you know, when the males are in sujood, wait until they come up before you come up. And we know in those days they weren't, you know, underwear as we have today. And it was really trying to protect them from perhaps a perchance gaze at something, you know, that they weren't supposed to see in terms of the nudity that they could have been exposed to, you know, again, but by chance. The Prophet, peace be Allah, the Most High, tells us in the Quran about Luqman the wise and the golden advice he told his son. You know, do not raise your voice, do not walk with haughtiness in the earth, you know. And these things lend themselves to humility, humbleness, modesty, you know. We are told, for example, not to seek permission when we enter the homes and seek permission when we're going into our parents' room. For example, you don't want to be exposed as a child. You tell your children this so that they are not exposed to things that they may find it difficult also to accept. For example, a son may love his mother so much, but if he just barged into the room and seen something that he wasn't supposed to see in an intimate point, the son could actually, the son could actually start to hate his father. You understand what I'm saying? And these
kids are psychologically affected, you know, basically if they see basically sex take place.
Exactly. So exactly. So you know, that's modesty. You know, we are told to dress in a modest way, to not be haughty in your dress, you know, to cover those aspects. And we have a code in our faith that says what should be covered and how it should be covered in a loose-fitting manner, for example, because it wants to protect the mind, it wants to protect the individual. You know, so whether it be dress, thoughts, action, we are told to spend on others in order to bring humility within ourselves. And with that comes a level of modesty also, you know. So I just
but on that point, you know, you spoke about like how in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, you know, at the masjid, for example, that how, for example, both men and women were present there, and how they had to watch their behavior even in the mosque space. It must be emphasized, the negative attitude that our community, by and large, within South Africa, particularly the interior provinces of this country, right, have had towards women coming to the mosque, right, has actually created a very, very negative attitude towards basically to women in general, right? To a point, what we keep missing, that while we have these beautiful examples from the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's life, right, and he's teaching his community how to behave modestly when sharing a space, is that he never bars one gender from from entering that space, even though they can be, if basically the modesty protocols, you know, are violated, right? They can be basically the fear of fitna, right? But he doesn't bar basically the woman from coming to the mosque. And that's something we need to learn in the society, because oftentimes when you have this gender apartheid, and I'm using this word, right, then you have young men whose whose minds do gymnastics, and the type of things they start to think about women. There's this hypersexualization of women, there's a sexual objectification of women, and that's a problem. And on the other side as well, so where it is natural that men and women should mix, but their interactions can be modest, we should allow that, right? And establish institutions that allow that. And when things are, you know, for example, require separate spaces, absolute separate spaces, not just that we can be in the same space but segregated, but they require separate spaces, like, for example, sporting and such, then by all means, then we must segregate. But this gender apartheid, thinking that we're going to preserve modesty by, I would say, going overboard, that one gender has no access to public spaces and to the public discourse, religiously speaking, but the entire world is actually pulling them out of their homes, right? That's an imbalance in our society itself. It doesn't promote modesty and virtue. It actually creates a huge imbalance within our society, and we're experiencing that. So I think that, yes, modesty, we emphasize modesty, but we to maintain the integrity and the balance within our society, the prophetic sunnah is key.
Yeah, indeed.
Um,
I think we've ran out of time, Anwar, so would you like to
Shukran
wrap
jazilan. Shukran jazilan for this very, very informative and interesting discussion. A little bit different, much different from last week's discussion, but we know that the inward and the outward, the metaphysical and the physical, are all part and parcel of this experience of life itself. Our ultimate return is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we ask Him basically to guide every one of our steps, to bless every one of our steps, and as we engage in this journey of life, that everything we do is pleasing to Him, and the ultimate journey is to Allah, and to Him we will return. Shukran jazilan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.